In March 2012, James Cameron sank almost 11 kilometers, alone, to the deepest point in the ocean. The first solo dive ever made to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The world called it a triumph, a record that still stands. What almost no one tells you is what was happening inside that sub while the cameras rolled. Thrusters were dying. Hydraulic fluid was leaking into the dark. He was spinning in slow, aimless circles over a dead gray plain, unable to pick up a single rock. And the machine that got him there never carried anyone down there again. To understand what happened to him down there, you have to understand where there actually is. The Challenger Deep is the lowest point on the surface of the Earth. It sits at the southern end of the Mariana Trench, in the western Pacific, and the deepest spot Cameron's instruments recorded was around 10,900 meters, almost 11 kilometers straight down. Numbers like that stop meaning anything, so try this instead. Take Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the planet. Lift it off the ground, lower it, peek up, into the trench. The summit, the place climbers die trying to reach, would still sit more than 2 kilometers underwater. You would have to keep swimming down, past the top of Everest, for another hour just to touch the bottom. And the water above you does not forget you're there. At that depth, the pressure is more than 1,000 times what you feel right now. It's the weight of 11 kilometers of ocean pressing on every part of you at once. Something like 8 tons on every square inch. The equivalent of balancing a small car on the tip of your finger and holding that everywhere on your body, all at once, forever. It is completely black. Sunlight has never reached it, not once in the entire history of the world, and it is just above freezing. This is the setting. Now here's the man who chose to go there alone. James Cameron is famous for making some of the highest-grossing films ever put on a screen. Titanic, Avatar. But that's not who showed up at the Mariana Trench. Long before any of those, in 1989, he made a film called The Abyss, a story about divers at the bottom of the ocean, and it left him with an obsession that never really went away. He wasn't a scientist. He was a director who taught himself deep ocean engineering because he refused to wait for anyone else to take him down. And here's the part that tells you who he is. He didn't just fund the expedition and buy himself a seat. He co-designed the submarine. He sat in the training tank for months. He learned to pilot a one-of-a-kind vehicle to a place only 2 human beings had ever reached. And that is not an exaggeration. In the more than 50 years between the first descent and Cameron's, exactly 2 people had ever been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. A Swiss engineer and a US Navy officer, back in 1960, in a bulky steel and gasoline craft called the Trieste. They got down there, and almost immediately their own vehicle kicked up a cloud of silt that swallowed the view. They stayed about 20 minutes. They saw next to nothing, and left. Then, for half a century, no human went back at all. That was the record Cameron was walking into. Not a well-trodden path, but a single blurred glimpse from another era. He wanted to go alone, stay for hours, and actually look. To do that, he needed a machine that did not exist yet. So he had one built, in near secrecy, on the other side of the world. They built it in a small workshop in Sydney, Australia. The lead engineer was a self-taught Australian named Ron Alum, a man with trade school credentials and no formal degree, who Cameron said could rebuild the spaceship in flight. It took them 7 years. It cost around $10 million, and it looked like nothing else in the ocean. A lime green vertical tube, standing on its end, closer to a giant cigarette lighter than a submarine. Instead of moving horizontally like a normal sub, it was built to drop straight down like a dart. Most of its body wasn't metal at all. It was foam, a special buoyant foam Alum had to invent himself, because everything on the market simply crushed at that pressure. He mixed the first batches by hand, using glass microspheres, resin, and a $500 kitchen cake mixer. At the very center of all that green foam sat a steel ball, the pilot sphere, with walls 2.5 inches thick, just big enough for one person to fold into, knees to chest. That ball was the only thing standing between James Cameron and 11 kilometers of crushing water. Bolted to the rest of that green tube was everything else the mission needed. A tall tower of powerful LED lights, and a set of custom 3D cameras Cameron had helped design specifically for this dive. In a very real sense, the whole submarine was a camera, a filmmaker's instrument, built to carry one obsessive director into the dark and let him see it with his own eyes. And on the morning of March 26, 2012, he climbed into that steel ball and sealed the hatch. Then he did the strangest thing. He did nothing. For over 2.5 hours, the sub simply fell. There is no engine roaring you downward. The whole design is built to sink, so descending just means letting go and waiting while the light bleeds out of the water above you. Blue turns to gray. Gray turns to a black so total that your own eyes start inventing things in it. Cameron later described watching the last of the surface disappear, and knowing that if anything went wrong down there, no one on Earth could reach him. As he sank, the temperature inside the sphere dropped toward freezing, and the whole structure would tick and groan as the pressure outside climbed into the thousands of pounds per square inch, squeezing the vehicle a little smaller with every 100 meters. There is no rescue at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. If the sphere failed, it would be over faster than his nerves could carry the signal. So he fell, alone, in a steel ball not much wider than his own shoulders, for 2 hours and 37 minutes, toward a place he had spent 7 years and $10 million trying to see. And when his lights finally caught the bottom, what they showed him was not what anyone had promised. He had been told, by people who study this for a living, that the deepest place on Earth might be teeming with strange, undiscovered life, that the extreme dark and pressure could be hiding creatures no one had ever imagined. Cameron, of all people, wanted monsters. This is the man who spent a career designing aliens and abyssal creatures for the screen. And what he found, when his spotlight swept across the floor of the world, was a desert. His own words, it was bleak. It looked like the moon. A flat, pale, gray plain, stretching out into the dark in every direction. No cliffs, no towering vents, no swarming life. He said he didn't see a single fish, nothing that looked alive to him at all, other than a few pale, shrimp-like amphipods drifting through his lights, animals barely longer than a grain of rice. Sit with that for a second. The most extreme, most anticipated place on the entire planet. The one spot everyone imagined would be full of secrets. And the man who got there first, alone, looked around and saw an empty gray parking lot at the bottom of the sea. The reversal wasn't the monster. It was the silence. And the strangest detail of all is those tiny amphipods. They look almost fragile, these pale little shrimp-like things, barely bigger than a grain of rice. And yet they were the one form of life thriving in a spot where the pressure would flatten a steel drum, where the cold sits at just above freezing and the dark is absolute. Not the giant, the monster, or the leviathan. The survivor at the bottom of the world was something you could hold a dozen of in the palm of your hand. One thing worth asking yourself while we're down here with him. If someone offered you that exact chance, the same steel ball, the same 11-kilometer drop, completely alone, no rescue, would you actually climb in and go? Or is that a door you'd never open? Tell me in the comments before we go any deeper. But the emptiness wasn't the only thing waiting for him. Because while Cameron was hovering over that gray plain, trying to take it all in, his machine was quietly dying underneath him. First, the sonar stopped working, which meant the baited traps his team had dropped to attract deep-sea animals couldn't be located in the dark, so that whole part of the mission was simply gone. Then something worse. Hydraulic fluid, the stuff that powers the sub's arm and its thrusters, began leaking out into the water. One by one, his thrusters started failing. In his own blunt words afterward, "I lost a lot of thrusters. I lost the whole starboard side." Think about what that actually means at the bottom of the ocean. Half of his ability to steer was simply gone. He couldn't hold a heading. He described himself just spinning slowly in a circle, over and over, unable to point the sub where he wanted to go, watching the same patch of empty seabed rotate past his window again and again. The deepest, most expensive dive in human history, and its pilot was drifting in slow loops in the dark, losing control of the one machine keeping him alive. Before we get to the part that almost never gets told, what he lost, and why he never went back, one quick thing. If stories from the bottom of the ocean are your kind of thing, subscribing is how you catch the next one the moment it goes up. There's a lot more of the deep still down there to cover. Now, back to Cameron. Here's the cruelest part, and it's the part that turns this from an adventure story into something sadder. The entire point of the second half of this expedition, the real prize, was science. Cameron didn't spend 7 years building this thing just to look at the dark. He wanted to reach down with the sub's robotic arm, grab rocks, scoop up sediment, and bring the deepest place on Earth back to the surface, where researchers could finally study it. Almost nothing living had ever been recovered from that exact spot. And with the hydraulics failing, the sampling arm barely worked. He said it himself. He couldn't pick anything up. He was there, at the bottom of the world, surrounded by material no human had ever touched, and he could not collect it. He described the moment perfectly. It became, in his words, a point of diminishing returns. Why keep circling a dead plane you can't sample, in a sub that's losing systems by the minute? So he made the call. He had planned to spend around 6 hours down there. He got maybe half of that. And then, far earlier than anyone wanted, James Cameron pointed what was left of his crippled submarine upward, dropped his steel weights, and began the long climb back toward the sun, carrying almost nothing with him but footage. And this is where the story takes the turn that the record books quietly leave out. Because after that dive, the triumph, the headlines, the record that still stands today, the Deepsea Challenger never carried a human being to the bottom again. Not once. There was supposed to be a phase 2. Cameron talked openly about going back, about exploring the north wall of the trench, about finally doing the science the broken arm had denied him. It never happened. Ship time in the middle of the Pacific cost something like $1 million a month, and the window closed. In 2013, on the 1-year anniversary of his dive, Cameron did something quietly final. He gave the submarine away. He donated it to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, not so it could dive again, but so engineers could take it apart and harvest its ideas, its foam, its lights, its cameras, and fold them into other machines. The record-setting sub became, in a sense, an organ donor. And then comes the detail I can't get out of my head. In July of 2015, the Deepsea Challenger was loaded onto a truck to travel from Massachusetts down to Maryland, on its way to be shipped across the world on loan to a maritime museum back in Australia, near where it had been born. On Interstate 95, in Connecticut, the truck's brakes failed, the tires caught fire, and the flames spread to the submarine. The machine that had survived 11 kilometers of ocean, more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, the single most hostile spot on the planet, was scorched and holed on the shoulder of an American highway. It endured the bottom of the world. It was very nearly destroyed by a brake fire in traffic. Cameron insisted the important parts survived. The pilot sphere, the thrusters, the robotic arm, the expensive systems all pulled through. And he called it a setback rather than an ending. But sit with the shape of that story for a second, because it's almost too perfect to be real. We build a machine to conquer the deepest, deadliest place on Earth. It works. It gets a human down and brings him back. And then it's very nearly killed, not by the abyss, but by us, by a worn brake pad and a stretch of interstate. The safest place for that submarine turned out to be the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The dangerous part was coming home. And the deeper you look, the more you notice the whole expedition carries that same strange residue. Cameron reached the most remote point in the natural world. And even there, he wasn't truly first. Only one crewed mission had ever touched that bottom before him, decades earlier. And they'd seen almost nothing through the silt. He wanted to correct that, to bring back the rocks, the creatures, the hard data that would finally tell us what's down there. Instead, the ocean broke his tools, sent him home with footage and a handful of rice-sized amphipods, and then, once he was safely back on land, his own world set fire to his ship. To this day, no one has repeated exactly what he did in that vehicle. The Deepsea Challenger sits in an institution now, studied and taken apart. A green tube that went to the bottom of the world once and was never allowed to go again. The record didn't fall because someone beat it. It stands because the story around it quietly came apart. The science unfinished, the sub grounded, the man moved on to other things. A triumph on the surface, something much lonelier underneath. There's an argument that still hangs over that dive, and it's worth being honest about it. Cameron only saw one small patch of an enormous trench, for a few crippled hours, through the window of a failing sub. Scientists were quick to point out, gently, that you cannot overinterpret a single glimpse. Maybe the bottom isn't a dead desert everywhere. Maybe he simply landed on the ocean's equivalent of an empty field and missed the forest a few kilometers away. And that argument is still out there, unresolved. Because the one thing that would settle it, going back, again and again, mapping it properly, is exactly what never happened. We have detailed maps of the surface of Mars, of the far side of the moon, of worlds hundreds of millions of kilometers away. The bottom of our own ocean, the trench in our own planet, remains one of the least explored places we know of. A man spent 7 years and $10 million to look at it for a few hours, lost half his sub trying, and came home with almost nothing. And then, for the most part, everyone just stopped. Almost. Because the trench didn't stay untouched forever, it just wasn't Cameron, and it wasn't his sub that went back. 7 years later, in 2019, a different man named Victor Vescovo dropped into the same Challenger deep in a completely different vehicle. And unlike Cameron, he dove it again and again, making what is now the deepest solo descent in human history. And here's the part that lands like a punch. Down there, on the floor of the deepest, most remote place on the entire planet, a place 2 people had glimpsed in 1960 and 1 man had struggled across in 2012, Vescovo's lights picked out a plastic bag, and what looked like a few candy wrappers, lying in the silt. Think about that. In all of human history, only a handful of people have ever reached that spot. Our garbage got there first. The deepest point on Earth, sunlight never touching it, pressure that would crush almost anything we own, and we still managed to leave our trash on the doorstep before we'd even properly arrived. Cameron went down looking for the alien and the unknown, and found a gray desert. Vescovo went down years later and found us. So here's what the record leaves out. He reached the bottom. That part is true, and it's genuinely extraordinary. But the bottom was a silent gray plain with almost nothing on it. His thrusters died. His arm failed. He couldn't bring the deep back with him. He never returned. And the machine that took him there was very nearly ended by a fire in traffic, on dry land, thousands of kilometers from the water that couldn't touch it. There's a whole world down there in the dark that we've barely started to look at. The deepest place a human being has ever been alone, visited exactly once, and then left to itself. And some of what has come up out of that dark since, from other trenches and other dives, is even harder to explain than an empty plain at the bottom of the sea. I'll see you on the next one.